Mr Speaker, I rise on behalf of New Zealand First. We will be supporting this bill through the first reading to the Select Committee. However, we do have some concerns, as has been voiced this evening in the Chamber. Covered bonds are debt securities backed by cash flows from mortgages or public sector loans, and a covered bond is a corporate bond with one important enhancement. It has a recourse to a pool of assets that secures or covers the bond if the originating financial institution becomes insolvent. In this day and age and in the world that we live in, it is becoming increasingly important that we do have these guarantees put in place to ensure a stable and reliable banking system. And in this respect, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand Covered Bonds Amendment Bill does help to bring New Zealand into line with many of our major trading partners, in particular Australia, the United States, and many of our trading partners in Europe and Asia. This goes back to the 1700s in terms of covered bonds, and Denmark was the first country back in the late 1700s to issue covered bonds, so it is a very, very old form of financial tool. More recently, of course, it has been a major tool used by European banking, but in more recent times, the likes of the United States introduced it in 2008, the US Treasury, and the Australian Treasury introduced it in 2010, 2011. New Zealand banks were the first in this part of the world to actually start using covered bonds back in 2010, but they did not have a legislative framework to work by, which is the purpose of this bill, to ensure that our banks do work to a legislative framework for those covered bonds. We do have some concerns in relation to the 10% level. Perhaps that needs to be considered by the Select Committee. As we heard earlier, Australia operates on the basis of an 8% maximum for covered bonds. Perhaps that has to be given full consideration by the committee, and perhaps even 8% is too high, as we've heard. Perhaps it needs to be lower, but at the end of the day, the size of the New Zealand financial market needs to be ascertained, and it needs to be worked out as to what could the New Zealand financial market sustain, so as not to overly affect other deposits of unsecured investors and our normal investors in our banks in New Zealand, so that they are not severely or significantly disadvantaged. It is good that the Reserve Bank will be monitoring this, and it will ensure that there is offshore capital coming into New Zealand in perhaps a more secure manner, and where offshore investors will see New Zealand as an even safer place to invest money in the situation where at the moment there is global turmoil in many areas of banking. However, Mr Speaker, I am concerned, and New Zealand First is concerned, that we have seen instances with financing troubles in terms of some of these types of situations with our banking, such as South Canterbury Finance, where after the government provided the government guarantees scheme for the financial institutions in New Zealand, we saw an instance of many of those financial institutions taking a great deal more deposits into their respective organisations with unfettered control by either Treasury or the Reserve Bank. And as a result, during a period, many of those financial institutions took on board significant deposits which subsequently failed and were a great loss to the New Zealand taxpayer. Mr Speaker, we must ensure that those sorts of failings do not occur again. As we've also heard from other speakers, we therefore want to ensure that this covered bond market does not end up in a situation where offshore investors see this as a very, very safe haven to put their money, guaranteed by these New Zealand financial banks and institutions, only to find that perhaps at the end of the day, if something were to occur and they were to become insolvent, that we, the New Zealand taxpayer, or some form of the New Zealand Treasury, may have to come to the assistance to prop up the banking system. Shudder the thought that that were to occur, so as a result of that, when this goes to the Select Committee, we certainly would be expecting that all these aspects are fully considered, so that the New Zealand taxpayer, the New Zealand government, is not put at risk through the covered bond schemes. However, Mr Speaker, we are confident that this does add another tool and another bow to the strength of our banking institutions in New Zealand to be competitive on the global financial stage. It will assist in terms of securing more capital into this country. Perhaps it might even be a situation, Mr Speaker, where if so much more capital is flowing in here as a result, that it may alleviate the requirement of this government to sell off assets and other things, state assets, to try and cover much of its funding and funds from elsewhere. It could well be, Mr Speaker, that this situation is so successful that it provides other financial sources for our New Zealand banks to provide much of the necessary capital for the infrastructure within New Zealand, for loans to the likes of local government and loans to the likes of infrastructure requirements within New Zealand without being a huge burden on the New Zealand Government and New Zealand Treasury. Mr Speaker, we will be supporting this through to the committee stage, but we will be requiring the Government to fully address many of the concerns that have been raised, and in particular, Mr Speaker, we'll be wanting to ensure that New Zealand investors and New Zealand unsecured depositors in our banks are not in any way less regarded or less given less advantages than those that would be under this scheme. We certainly don't want to see a situation, Mr Speaker, where New Zealand investors again are left in the lurch. So, Mr Speaker, we support this to committee stage.
Speaker.
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, it's